Welcome to the Bilingual Montessori webinar series. Hello, I'm Amy with Bilingual Montessori. We are here to support you in building stronger bilingual programs. This series has been made possible through funding by Erasmus Plus with the European Union. In this webinar, Birgitta Berger guides us through the process in which languages are learnt so that you can create an experience for your students from a foundation of modern language theories and research. With this greater understanding of terminology and how language is absorbed and learnt, you can best support your students to move forward with their second language. Birgitta shares different points for you to be aware of that will help you as a teacher to support the students in your classroom. Currently contributing to language education at the Campus de Monaco International Montessori School in Munich, Birgitta not only is an experienced teacher, but also a published author. She has a rich background in bilingual environments spanning England, Germany, and Thailand. She has developed a Montessori-based approach to foreign language learning, sharing her expertise in Montessori teacher training and continuing education programs in Germany. After viewing this webinar, you will gain a deeper understanding that language acquisition is a gradual process involving inevitable errors. That is part of the process. We are reminded that the emphasis should be on fostering growth rather than achieving flawless language production, recognizing it as an ongoing learning journey. This insight is valuable not only for educators, but also for collaborating with parents to enhance support in the learning environment. Birgitta, it is my pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you, Amy, and hello. Languages, be they second or foreign languages, play an ever-growing role in elementary schooling and education. But how do children actually learn additional languages? That's what we'll be looking at in the next 30 minutes or so. So here we go, second language acquisition, an introduction for elementary teachers. I'd like to just familiarize you with a few of the terms that I'll be using during this talk. You'll come across the two terms, acquisition and learning, and we'll be looking more closely at the difference between the two. We'll also be referring to first, family, home language, and the abbreviation L1. I'll be talking about the target language, which can be a second, an additional language, or an L2, another term that you'll come across. And we'll also be looking at the term foreign languages. But to get us started, I would like to begin with a quote from Dr. Montessori, who described the linguistic development of young children. A child can only acquire the words he hears spoken around him. This is not teaching, but absorption. The child is, by nature, hungry for words. He loves strange, long words, like the names of dinosaurs and constellations. He takes in all these words without understanding their meaning, as his mind is still taking language in by a process of unconscious absorption. To quote Dr. Montessori. And this description still holds true today. We still regard the learning of the first language, the mother tongue, as an almost magical process. It's also been likened to a sponge taking in the surrounding liquid by a similar process that we also refer to as absorption. Dr. Rosemary Tracy has described the acquisition of the first language, the home language, the mother tongue, as a success story. Just to go back to those terms, mother tongue is the familiar term that we use sort of in everyday language, but a growing awareness of the different family settings, that it may be the father's language and not just the mother's language, has led to the use of this term L1, or first language, as the first language a child learns in its family surroundings. Yes, and as Rosemary Tracy says, it's a success story. Children are born with the ability to learn languages if they are born with all natural abilities to lead a normal life. The process takes place through physical and verbal interaction with the environment and the human beings there. That's something very important we know about, that it takes human beings for children to learn their first language. It's a process that takes place without there being any teaching, without there being instruction or correction. We do know that baby talk is not something that is grammatically correct, that children, from the time they speak with just the first syllables, making noises, then starting to experiment with words and then putting those words together, they do not produce correct language, but without our needing to instruct them, without our needing to correct them, this language constantly evolves and develops. And this process also takes place independent of intelligence. So no matter whether the level of intelligence of a child is lower or higher, they are able to acquire their first language. And this process is also independent of modality, which means that the language they learn can be a spoken, but also a signed language, something that some families are making increased use of in introducing sign language to their very young children as an additional means of communication. And the last point to look at is that this process can be an acquisition of one or several languages, 2 or even 3 languages being acquired simultaneously. So second or additional or foreign languages are what we're going to focus on now mainly. So they are the languages that follow the first language. The process of acquisition can take place at the same time, simultaneously, or it can take place at a later time. The differentiation that we make between second and foreign languages is that second languages usually are acquired within the family setting or within the living environment, the place, town, suburb, country in which the child is living, and which could be dominated by a language other than the language being used within the family. So that's where the term second language comes in. It can also then be the language used in the school or children's house, casa, kindergarten that the child is visiting. So it can also be then the language of formal education. Foreign languages are what we refer to as languages that are not part of the environment or the region that the child is in. So if you take, for example, a Korean family moving to Germany, the child's first language may be Korean because it's its parents' language. The second language will be German because that's the language of the environment, also the language of school or kindergarten or children's house. And foreign languages then to be learnt in a German educational setting will be English and possibly French, Spanish, Latin, and so on. So that's the differentiation and terminology for you there. Let's look more closely at the way in which second additional foreign languages are learned. This is regarded as a conscious process, usually. And as you can see in the picture, the girl holding up the magnetic board, smiling at us. She is very much aware of the fact that what she is now doing is learning another language, learning English. So it's a process that is explicit and is usually involving instruction, involving some kind of teaching setup. What has been found out, especially now that neuroscience is taking a closer look at the process of language learning, is that emotions play an incredibly important role in the success of the learning of second, additional, and foreign languages. Motivation, of course, is also a very strong driving force, intrinsic motivation being the stronger and the more effective of the two. We also know that the success in learning a second, additional, or foreign language is influenced by the language skill and language competence in the L1, in the first language. So the more a child has developed its first language, the easier it will be to then acquire and learn a second language. In this case, the level of intelligence does play a role. It is easier for children with a higher level of intelligence to acquire and learn additional languages. Literacy also plays a strong role in that all the literary skills that a child has and can use and can make use of will support learning of second and additional languages. We'll have a look at age dependency in a moment. Yes, age does play a role, but it is slightly more complex than we are sometimes aware of. I'd just like to contrast and compare the two terms that I've been using, acquisition and learning. We speak of acquisition when learning, or I'll just start again. I'd like to compare and contrast the two terms, acquisition and learning. We speak of acquisition when this intake of a new language takes place in informal situations, when it's a process that is implicit, subconscious. We know that it follows stages of acquisition which are very similar to the stages of acquisition of the first language. And we also know that the success in acquisition depends very strongly on attitude. Learning, on the other hand, takes place in formal and institutional settings. So a school, for example, would be a setting for this type of process. Learning is something that takes place explicitly, consciously. Children and learners are aware of the fact that they are in a learning process. The order in which language is then learnt is very often according to an externally and predefined pattern or curriculum. So here I've used the term order of learning, but yes, it's based on a curriculum or a set of guidelines, a course book possibly, externally decided upon by linguistic experts. What determines success in learning of languages is mainly aptitude, what we refer to as the qualities of a good learner or successful language learner. To give you an example, research has shown that successful language learners, for example, are risk takers. That is seen as one of the most important qualities they have, being willing and able to take risks in terms of trying out something new, not being sure whether it's going to work or not, seeing what the communication situation holds for them, experimenting and exploring. In both cases, whether we're talking about acquisition or learning, we need to take into consideration and regard the personality and the development of each individual learner. So it's not just the two settings that we're looking at. We always need to keep in mind that each learner is an individual and that individual learning can take different forms and can be a different process. The critical or sensitive period in the learning of languages. Well, first of all, as regards the first language, that is undisputed, that there is a critical period for the learning, for the successful learning and acquisition of the first language. And it's usually seen as something taking place from birth or the first 6 months until about the 3rd year of life of a child. When we come to second or additional language learning, the story is much more complex. There are theories that say that there is a critical or then followed by a sensitive period for the learning of second and additional languages. But research in the last years has shown that actually the situation is much more complex. Yes, young children are open-minded. They like to copy. They like to try out new things. They are less inhibited than older students. But research has also shown that older students, and here we're talking about sort of the beginning of the onset of puberty, so the 12 to perhaps 18-year-olds have other advantages that also can support successful language learning. So the curve that you show here, that you see here, does not have an age range given. And I've purposely left that out because it is something that can differ from individual to individual, differ according to the setting and the environment. What we can say, though, is that younger children find it easier to learn the phonology of a new language, meaning that they find it easier to pronounce the words in the same way as the native speaker or the language speaking model pronounces this target language. So yes, there is definitely an advantage in terms of phonology, but in terms of lexis, the vocabulary or grammatical structures, it's not that easy to make a general statement. I like this quote from Owen Crisfield, sort of summarizing what I've just tried to explain to you, putting the essence in a nutshell. She says that learning a new language, no matter your age, just takes time. It takes effort and the right circumstances. It needs enough input to understand how the language works, and it requires a need to use it. So a meaningful context for that language then to be implemented. And I think that's a very helpful term, that's a very helpful perspective for us to bear in mind. More helpful than just saying this is the magical age for learning to take place. Montessori's planes of development shown in this graph can also help us understand the aptitude and the attitude of children and teenagers as they're learning languages. If we look at the second plane of development from the age of 6 to 12, which Montessori describes as the period of mental independence, we can see that there is a great elaboration of the mind and the personality. Montessori describes this learner and children at this stage as explorers, being hungry for new knowledge, for new learning. And of course, this is very conducive to the whole concept of language learning as well. We also find that children at this stage are more uninhibited, are more friendly to trying themselves out in a new context, be that new knowledge or a new language. So they do bring along many advantages that we as language teachers can make use of. Now let's have a look at stages of actual second language acquisition. A theory that comes in very helpful in regarding how children acquire a new language is the so-called processability theory, developed by a German linguist, Manfred Pienemann. He studied how learners acquire German and English as a second language, and formulated the hypothesis that learners of any language go through universally identical stages of acquisition. And according to his theory, the order of these stages cannot be changed, but individual learners can go through these stages at varying speeds, and their progress can vary significantly. And from this, Manfred Pienemann formulated the so-called teachability hypothesis, whereby only the learnable is teachable. I'll show you what that means in the next slide, where we can look at these stages of L2 acquisition in more detail. To his stages, I've added a 0 stage, the silent period, just to take into consideration and to bear in mind that all learning of language begins with listening, with watching, with noticing, with the so-called silent period, a period which is longer the younger a learner is. The older they get, the more willing they will be to start producing language and the more able. But again, it's something that varies from learner to learner. So it's, again, something that can be very individual. Language production then begins at stage 1, and all learners begin just by using simple words and formula. So something like hello, or a question like how are you, what's your name, or a sentence like my name is Birgitta. Used as a formula, as a chunk, without there being any awareness of how sentences, how statements or questions are actually formed. As learners then move on to the subsequent stages, here we can see stage 2, they produce language that is not considered well-formed, or that is not grammatically speaking correct language. They include more and more elements to express their meaning. But you see here, me no live here. There is, for example, no use of an auxiliary at this second stage. In the third stage, we do see an auxiliary, do, you live here, being used, but there is not yet subject-verb agreement. Do, not following the subject he. We move on to stage 4 with more complex and more congruent statements being made. Is she at home? And at stage 5, we come to negations, auxiliaries being used in the right place, following a question word such as why or what. And very interesting for language teachers to see that the third person singular S in Peter likes bananas is something that is produced spontaneously by learners at stage 5 of language acquisition, which explains why the teaching of this form, Peter likes third person singular S in the present simple, is so often unsuccessful, explaining frustration both in teachers and in learners. When you're trying to teach a stage 5 form, but a learner is still in the first, second, third, or fourth stage. So just to go back to the hypothesis formulated by Manfred Pienemann, only the learnable is teachable. Only the stage that is one further from where the learner is currently situated is actually then accessible and learnable for the learner, which means that it's only also teachable for us as coming from the teaching perspective. So important to know that errors are a part of this language acquisition and these stages, and that that what we are aiming for can only be the next stage or the next step. So yes, just to remind you of that learners of any language go through universally identical stages. The order cannot be changed, and speed and progress can vary significantly. Only the learnable is teachable. Being aware of the stages of language acquisition helps us understand better the concept that Larry Zielinker described as the interlanguage. You can see here on the left-hand side the L1, the first language that the learner is coming from, the starting point. And on the right-hand side, you see the L2, the target language, the language that the learner is aiming to acquire. And between the two, you see spirals and a constantly changing, evolving construct, which is described as interlanguage. You could also call it the learner's language. It's a bit like baby talk or child's language if you're looking at the first language. It's something that is changing, developing, evolving based on knowledge in the L1, based on universal properties of that language, based on input, of course, that the learner is getting in the language and learning context, depending on literacy skills, something that we already mentioned, taking into account individual learner differences, and of course supported by metalinguistic awareness. But being aware of this means that we're aware that language that learners produce and that children are producing as they are learners and as they are in a stage of acquiring an additional language will always show some characteristics of this interlanguage in not being the perfect and the target language at the level of a native speaker. How can we support this process of acquisition? It takes two sides, or it has two sides. One is the input side. One is, so to speak, then the language that children and learners hear, that they listen to, that they read, both in terms of phonology, lexis, and grammar. And the other part of this acquisition process and the necessary part of developing the interlanguage, the learner's language, in order to support acquisition is output, which means actual language production by the learner in terms of phonology, in terms of lexis and grammar. So sort of the two sides of the coin that make up this language acquisition or language learning, both input and output play a vitally important role. As we're looking at language learning in an educational setting, it's very helpful also to be aware of the two levels of language learning in terms of the terminology coined by Jim Cummins, and using the metaphor, the image that he gave us, has given us to understand better. He uses the image of the iceberg, and this is also referred to as Cummins' iceberg theory. The iceberg, as we know, with a small tip that's visible above the water and a large body of the iceberg invisible but very, very present below the water. In terms of language learning, Jim Cummins coined the term BICS, Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills, an acronym for the language that's necessary for day-to-day living, day-to-day conversation taking place with friends, in informal interaction, and so on. This is very strongly context embedded, which means as we are communicating, as we are relating to people in a context of school, of a family environment, or just the personal environment, the context is very much supportive of understanding. We can see from the reactions of the people we're talking to, from the momentary situation, what is required or what is meant. So the context supports understanding and supports use of language here. And we say that it takes from something between 6 months to 2 years for these BICS skills, for these basic interpersonal communication skills to develop. And they are the skills that, when we're looking at a foreign language, are being acquired in the language learning context. Where we're looking at second language or bilingual educational settings, it's very important to be aware that there is this body of the iceberg what Cummins refers to as cognitive academic language proficiency, which is the language that is necessary to understand and discuss content in the classroom. So that's sort of another level of language skill and language proficiency. Why is it so much more difficult? That has to do with the fact that it is context reduced. So that means there are fewer non-verbal cues. The language is much more abstract. It's related to content that is perhaps not visible, not tangible in the environment, that is related to the curriculum, to curricular goals and standards. It takes much, much longer for this cognitive academic language proficiency to develop, something between 3 and 7 years, according to research and findings here. The good news is that all the CALP, all the proficiency in cognitive academic language that a child has acquired in its first language can be drawn on, can be transferred to the CALP in the second or in the target language. So the higher the academic language proficiency in the first language, the easier it is to transfer that, to make use of that, to draw upon that in the second or target language. So if we're looking at surroundings and situations that are conducive to acquisition and learning of languages, then neuroscience has good news for us. There are very, very tangible and very concrete guidelines how we can support the brain in learning and acquiring additional languages. Language work that is brain-friendly awakens curiosity. So we're looking again at this condition of being an explorer, of wanting to find out, wanting to learn. Brain-friendly language work appears relevant. It is important, or it is meaningful to the learner in some way. And that can be something that is very personal, that is very individual. Again, here we're looking at individual learners and their development. But what we can say, what is true and holds true for all learners, that they need a space that is free from stress and where they need not fear that they may fail. Very important for us to keep that in mind in terms of this language conducive environment. Yes, we need to cater to variations in individual development. I've been stressing that as I've been going along. But what can entice learners is giving them problems to solve. For younger learners, especially involving musical or physical or creative activities. Natural repetition, not necessarily a standard drill, but a situation where repetition is something that develops naturally. That also supports language learning. And we know that images play a very large and strong role in language work, because images are something that our brain can relate to very quickly, very directly, and images can be linked and supportive of language work. Brain-friendly language work also offers social spaces for collaboration and cooperation. And we know that the process of language learning is not something that takes place just sort of in a solitary space of confined learning, but requires interaction, requires the peers, and of course the language guide, the teacher, and that collaboration offers that space for trying out, for resonating, for having a context within which to use the language in a meaningful way. What are the pedagogical implications of all that? I would like to quote Douglas Barnes, who looked at successful language and successful language learning, and has told us to focus on the learning process itself rather than the teaching process. He says, to learn is to develop relationships between what the learner knows already and the new system being presented to him. And this can only be done by the learner himself. And our role and our objective as teachers and as guides is to support this learning process, to follow it closely, to observe it, and to enable the learner to develop their full scope. I will now unshare my screen. We've seen that language acquisition and language learning are complex processes, and they are not yet fully understood by researchers. But what we do know, and what I have tried to show you, is that we need to focus on the individual learner and their path of learning. Each child experiences its own language learning story, and we teachers are in the wonderful position of being able to guide and support this growth, unlocking each child's potential. Thank you very much.